Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Dirts of Gaming and my final update and build guide for the Vaal Lightning Strike Raider in 3.21. Before we jump into the video, I just need to go through a couple of points on the build. I've built this the way I want to build it. I've deliberately not used omniscience because I want to get life and plenty of defenses into the build to make it almost invulnerable in a normal mapping scenario. There's plenty of ways you can build this character to get much more damage, but I wanted a really well-rounded character. The second thing to note is I've got lots of specific things in the build that go together to make it work, and it could be very hard to try and replicate it exactly. So I wouldn't recommend going on trade and buying all the pieces, putting it together, because every item is rolled specifically for the build and it's going to be very difficult to do it. But I will go through how I crafted the items if you are interested in building the character in a similar manner. In terms of what it's done, it can do everything. It's done Deathless Wave 30 simulacrums, it's done Uber bosses. Although I will say, if you want a build to Uber boss, this is not the one. Any build where you've got to be in melee range for Uber bosses, it's just not very nice. You just basically need to blitz the content with a silly amount of DPS, which this build has decent burst DPS, but it's not something where you can go in and one-phase Uber bosses. So you're going to need to know the mechanics if you want to get them done. If you needed to do them for just challenges, it's fine. But if you wanted to build specifically to Uber boss, this isn't it, because anything where you have to stand still to do damage, it's A, very difficult, and B, you get very limited damage windows compared to either a damage over time totem or mine build, where you can just run around avoiding the attacks and you're still going to get uptime on your DPS. So with that out of the way, let's jump into the build guide. So the reason I've picked Lightning Strike as my second build of the league is it's something I historically played league after league. I love the skill, I love Raider, I love how the build feels, and I love how you can scale both defenses and attack with this kind of build. However, when it got nerfed, it kind of limited the appeal for a league start character, and even with investment, it still didn't feel amazing. Now with the introduction of Vengeance Cascade, Crucible trees, and some nodes on the tree, it actually feels more powerful than it did before, but it is slightly more difficult and more expensive to build. I'll run through the gear, the gem links, and everything on the build if you did want to do it yourself, and I'll try and include how I crafted each item, because if you look for these items on trade, they're going to be super expensive because they're all very well-rolled rare items. The reason I built it like this is I have two setups which we'll go through, one for mapping, one for bossing. In the mapping setup, you are nearly invulnerable in maps. You should not die. You've got max chaos resistance, as you can see here, big physical damage reduction, maximum chance to evade. I've actually increased the physical damage reduction by 7% because I've added in a different Watcher's Eye. So when I'm mapping, I never feel like I'm going to die. Now, you are still potentially going to get one-shot by something like a Metamorph if you've got super damage mods on the map. And there's still things I can do to improve the defenses, but at the moment, this is what I'm sticking with for the build. And then the idea is probably to farm something like a Mage Blood if I can find the time to do it, add it to the build because it's going to make it even stronger and even more fun. So before we jump into the details, I just want to explain that this build itself, when you get it set up, is very beginner friendly in terms of playstyle. But getting geared in the way that I have is not very easy. You need to be very confident in crafting. You need to be comfortable knowing how to fix issues if your build doesn't quite perform. This isn't a build, the way I've set it up, where you're going to be able to go on trade and buy all these items, because most of them are very specific. And it might be that you buy what you think are the right items, you spend 40 divines, and the build just doesn't perform anywhere near like it does in the showcases. So I will say as a warning, if you're a beginner and you're not comfortable crafting or fixing the build yourself, I probably wouldn't try this build. If you're confident with just simple essence crafting, meta crafting, and you are confident that you can solve a problem that might come up with the build, because I'm not going to get a chance to respond to everyone's issues if lots of people have difficulties, then I'd 100% recommend this build. It is super fun, but it is quite an expensive build. So the first thing to cover off is the helm enchant, because it is mandatory for the build. You can get around it, but it's still going to be suboptimal, which I'll explain in a moment. The reason I'm bringing this up is because no one's really playing hit-based Lightning Strike. People are playing like a poison variant. This helmet, the Blizzard Crown with 2 additional projectiles, brings massive power to the build. It brings a lot of damage, and the enchant itself makes the skill playable, because the way they nerfed the skill, they took a ton of projectiles off of the base gem, and you now only get 2. You get 1 and then 2 extra, so you get 3 projectiles. With this enchant, it puts up to 5, and that makes it feel playable. I still take an extra one here, so I have 6 projectiles. I think you're going to be fine with 5, and if you cannot get a helmet with the enchant on it, you're going to need to take multi-shot. Then you're going to also need to get a claw cluster. There is a notable where your skills that fire a projectile fire an additional projectile. you're going to need to get that because just having 4 is not going to feel very good if you're looking to do juice mapping. So that is one caveat to look out for. This was cheap. I paid like 40C for it. If loads of people play the build, it's going to go up to 6 to 8 divines because there's just not much available on the market. You could obviously get your own crown and get a lab runner to get the enchant for you, or you could just look for a normal helmet and roll some Eldritch implicits on it. But this here, don't be surprised if this shoots up in price. So with that out of the way, let's just go through the interactions with the build that are important, and then we'll go through the gear, how I crafted it, and then we'll go on to the skill tree. So because we're a strike skill, strike additional targets is mandatory. Really, you need +2 if you are going to map in any sort of juiced environment. It basically doubles your clear speed. These are obviously expensive to roll because you have to get them up to tier 2, which you have to elevate because you can't roll this naturally. The other option you've got, however, if you just wanted to do it on a budget, is the mastery here. You can do target 1 additional nearby enemy. So instead of doing a setup like I've got here, which has got a impossible escape, you just take all these nodes because attack speed is always good for Lightning Strike. The more you get, the better it feels. Take your multi-shot, and then here you would take the mastery to strike an additional target. Then you only need the 1 on your gloves, which are dirt cheap. You can pick up a pair for like 20, 25 chaos. Speed is super, super important on any melee build because the base melee attack speed of any skill pretty much feels awful. So the type of claw you use is super important, along with trying to get as much attack speed into the build as possible, which is why I'm going the onslaught route, which we'll come on to shortly. Along with that, you have to get pierce into the build. Otherwise, your clear is going to be really, really bad because you will hit one enemy with your projectiles and then they'll either come back to you if you've got Vengeance Cascade or they'll just disappear. Pierce is quite easy to get though. It's available on the tree. You can get 3 here. You can get 2 pierce there, 1 pierce there. Again, if you're not using some sort of thread of hope or impossible escape, just path there. They're still decent nodes anyway. And you can also, as a prefix, craft them onto your gear with an Exile. So I've got them on my gloves, but on my helmet, I've gone for Fizz taken as fire, which I'll come on to in a moment. And they're kind of the key parts of Lightning Strike, along with trying to get your shock effect up, because that's what's going to do 20% more damage if you get really, really good shock. So you see here, we've taken a mastery to get non-damaging elements higher when we crit, which is going to be most of the time. Again, we'll come onto this in a bit more detail later. But the takeaways from it are, you need strike additional target, preferably 2. You need minimum of 5 projectiles firing from your lightning strike, and you need at least 2 pierce. I would say 3 pierce feels very, very comfortable, but the more you can get, the better. So we'll move on to the gear, and I will try and explain how I crafted it because the gear is very, very good. I've been really specific about crafting it. I've taken my time. I've used hundreds of essences and lots of divines to get the gear this way. If you just wanted DPS, you could just go and Omni set up, stack attributes, but you're going to be lacking life. And then it's very hard to get stuff like suppression, ailment avoidance, chaos resistance into your build because any suffix you use, you're sacrificing a slot that could have attributes to boost your omniscience up. And that's the reason I haven't switched, because I looked at going Omni and trying to keep some of my defenses, and I could only get about 1100 omniscience, and my DPS went up about 1%, and my defenses and life plummeted. So we'll start with the claw. Now, because I'm not going omniscience, I've essentially got 2 options for claws. I can either go the normal claw with triple elemental attributes, so lightning damage, cold damage, fire damage, attack speed, and crit. But because I'm not going Omni, I have very little pen in the build, and 13% penetration actually ends up about the same DPS as a tier 2 elemental roll. So what I've done is bought the best claw I could afford at the time, which is a fractured T2 lightning damage, but it's a high roll on T2. I would have liked T1, but they were very, very expensive. And for the extra 5% damage, I didn't think it was worth it at the time. If you are going for a big, big claw, then obviously you'll buy a fractured T1 base. It wants to be an Imperial Claw. It gets good attack speed and decent base crit chance. And then all I've done on this is spammed deafening essences of hatred or deafening essences of anger until I've either hit my 3rd elemental prefix, or in this case, T1 attack speed. When you hit T1 attack speed, you're pretty much always going to have a suffix that you're going to have to annul off, which I've then done, and then multi-modded it, and that is the claw done. It did cost quite a lot to do because it's quite a lot of essences to either hit T1 attack speed, or if you're going for like T2 fire, it's quite a lot of essences to do it. In terms of the Crucible tree, you've got a lot of options for claws. Essentially, you want to try and get this node. This node is massive. 15% explicit elemental damage modifier magnitudes just increases the elemental damage on your claw by 15%. There's lots of other things you can get though, but you're looking for basically attack speed, crit chance, and this elemental damage modifier here. Now, the claw I was going for was a little bit unlucky. I actually had this mod on it linked as well, but as it is, it's now not linked up. We could probably link it up by trying to do the Crucible tree again, but I'm really happy with what we've got. So I ended up with a very low tier here, which is just basically no lightning damage and crit chance, increased attack speed, increased explicit elemental damage modifiers. If I wanted to gamble, I would just get a claw with a really big T1 attribute here, not allocate any others, and then smash them together and hope that these two keep. But these two are massive, so I'm just keeping the claw as it is. The shield is, again, something that I crafted. It cost quite a lot of essences, but I was very specific about what I wanted. I needed spell suppression. I actually only needed like the minimum tier. It ended up that I rolled a big tier, but it wasn't necessary. I wanted evasion and I wanted chaos resistance. So the way I was doing this is I bought a very cheap base. This was like 20C for a max elemental ailment roll. And then I spammed chaos resistance essences on it until I hit my suppression and evasion, and then crafted life. Or I was looking for big life and I can craft evasion. So this shield gives me almost 1500 evasion. For the Crucible tree, I've not really played around with this because I've got a decent tree. It's plus 80 life, minus 5 elemental resistances, plus 27 chaos, and minus 6. So you just need to basically overcap your resistances by 11%, and this downside has no effect whatsoever. I can obviously get a better claw. There's stuff like increased effective shock and things like that. But for now, I'm happy with it, and I don't really want a project around Crucible because I'm not loving the RNG of the mechanic. For the helmet, Blizzard Crown, Lightning Strike fires 2 additional projectiles, and then I basically spammed the life essences until I've got a decent helmet. This didn't cost very much to get, and then I've just crafted Fizz Taken as fire as my prefix. The amulet could be better, but I need the attributes, and it's going to cost me a lot to get a better amulet, and I might get maybe some extra flat damage on it or some LE damage with attacks. I can maybe improve it a little bit. But at the moment, I was just looking for big attributes, crit multi, life, resistance, and then non-challenge skills crafted on. The 2 rings again are just big life, big resistance, accuracy, LE damage with attacks, non-challenge skills. So these are very specific again for the build. Accuracy, you're going to find with attack builds now, you might have slight issues with accuracy, especially if you go omniscience. I also didn't want to have to waste a point to get more accuracy on the tree, which is why I've kind of aimed for it on rings where we do have some leeway with the suffixes. And then the second ring is just a big chaos resistance ring with non-challenge skills. This was really easy to craft. You just buy a fractured base with life, and then you spam chaos in harvest until you get big chaos resistance and any other stats that interest you. The chest piece, I need to re-roll because I don't need the resistances on it anymore. So basically all of the suffixes are wasted. Dexterity gives me a tiny bit of evasion and accuracy. But overall, you're just looking for big life and then whatever resistances you need to fix your build. And then I've crafted Fizz Taken as fire and lightning for more defenses. What I'll probably do with this is actually just recraft the chest completely by a fractured base with T1 fractured armor and evasion, and then craft to try and get something like fizz damage reduction and a massive life roll. That again improves my defenses, but for now it's just big life and resistances. And then I've got determination aura effect, again for more defenses, and increased non-curse aura effect, again to boost up all of the auras that I'm running. The gloves, as I said, are target 2 additional enemies and projectiles pierce an additional target. But essentially what you do is you roll +1 strike on your gloves, and then you have to elevate it up to Orb of Conflict to strike 2. The easiest way to do it is make sure that the Eater mod is always higher than your strike mod, and it's more likely to elevate. So let's say you rolled this at greater, you would just roll a grand Eater mod on your glove. Then when you hit your Orb of Conflict, it's more likely to elevate, but it's not guaranteed. And I had very, very bad luck crafting this. This cost me an absolute fortune, and I was definitely above the unlucky side in terms of my RNG. I've gone for a fractured accuracy base, big accuracy, because this is something, as I say, unless you aim for it on the tree or you go and take masteries, you're not going to cap your accuracy on an attack build at the moment, even with 20 precision. So it just makes it easy, and it makes me not have to worry about my accuracy at any point. And I got quite lucky crafting these. I've just spammed life essences, and I ended up with what looks like a T1 suppression roll, mediocre chaos resistance, some cold damage to attacks, and an open prefix to craft another pierce. So we've got lots and lots of pierce on the build. We've got 2 from these gloves, then we've got 2 from the tree, which gives me 4, which feels plenty. The boots are fairly straightforward, but it depends what sort of ailment roll you've got on your shield. But just a normal elemental ailment avoidance on your implicit, so with Graters, and then crafting it with Deafening Essences of Loathing, you're going to cap your ailment avoidance. What I've done with this, I bought movement speed, and then I've spammed Deafening Essences of Loathing until I've hit spell suppression. And then I've just crafted life onto the boots. The fire resistance was nice, but I wasn't aiming for it. I think I slammed this with an X because it came out as a 5-mod item. But this was just spamming Loathing Essences until I hit suppression, which is the reason when I'm looking for suppression, I've gone pure evasion bases because it's much more likely to hit. If you have an armor evasion base, you're much less likely to hit suppression, so your crafting gets more expensive. And an Stygian is big life, resistances, and LE damage with attacks, fairly straightforward. I think I paid 3 divines for this, but looking on trade, they've come down quite a lot. You could probably pick something up like this for 1 divine. And the Corrupted Blood Jewel I spent quite a bit of money on because I just wanted to eke as much damage and Corrupted Blood out of the jewel as I can. And it turned out that the cheapest one also had Cannot Be Maimed. The flask, I'm just using a Granite Flask with armor, Jade Flask with evasion, Diamond Flask with crit chance, and then a Quicksilver Flask with attack speed. These could be rolled better, but I plan to go Mage Blood, hopefully at some point, and I'm going to spend ages rolling flasks. Then I really don't want to have to do it now to then replace the flask later on. It would make a bit of a difference if I could get like more crit chance, although I am capped in most scenarios. I could probably get this up to 17%, but like there's not really worth playing around with these flasks. And then in terms of the jewels and tree, this again is going to take some time to go through because a lot of it's really specific. So I picked up this Impossible Escape because it was cheap. Again, if everyone follows this build, this is going to be mega expensive. It's not needed. I'm pretty sure you can pick up these with a Thread of Hope because they look like they're definitely in line with this jewel socket here. And you can move your Lethal Pride up here, or you can just path to all of these. It does cost you points, but they're points that do give damage. So you could maybe drop these nodes are not amazing. You could drop these to pick up this wheel here. I'd say you can even pick up an additional strike if you wanted to. You could get monsters cannot block attacks, which feels really nice. And then you just path to these. They're decent nodes anyway. This is the best option, in my opinion, but Impossible Escapes are limited. There's so many that drop. If a lot of people decide they want one, they spiral out of control. The only reason I'm mentioning this is I bought my Tornado Shot video out where I used an Impossible Escape to go to Conduit. It cost me very little money whatsoever. When I went to resell it to build this character, there were about 8 divines because everyone is following what I did letter for letter rather than trying to find other solutions. So if it's cheap, go for it because you can get From the Shadows, Multi-Shot, Mark the Prey, and Piercing Shots, which are all good. But if not, look for alternatives. Look for a Thread of Hope. Look for pathing where you can. There's going to be other ways that you can do it rather than spend 8 divines on a jewel that probably is not worth it. Bear in mind, you could also move this jewel here if you didn't want to do it, and that frees up 2 points. So there's lots of ways of doing it. My large cluster jewel, again, don't copy this node for node because you're going to end up spending a fortune. I've wanted Storm Rider and Overshock, but they're not build breaking. Storm Rider is really good because it gives me power charges. However, at some point, I'm probably not even going to need them. You could just maybe look to get power charge on kill is going to be enough. But if you wanted a decent 8 passive cluster, I recommend Overshock and Storm Rider. They just synergize really well with Lightning Strike. But again, with other builds, just attack clusters are really good. Claw clusters can get +1 projectile. Don't go spending a fortune on a jewel just because it's one that I'm using. Now, I'm pretty sure these could be better, but I've had them since the beginning of the build. I could probably get a little bit more crit chance or damage out of them if I re-rolled them. So I've got pressure points and precise retaliation. All I would really make sure is you get pressure points because, again, it's chance to deal double damage and increase crit strike chance. Other than that, if you don't want to run precise retaliation, run basics of pain, it's basically crit chance and damage. I think it probably will work out slightly better than this. And I like to build my characters to stay alive. So I've got an armor cluster jewel in here with enduring composure, which gives me endurance charges every time I'm hit. And it counts as spells as well. So even though we have 95% chance to evade, we get hit by every single spell. So this is pretty much up all the time. I've never noticed an issue with not keeping up my endurance charges. In here, I've got a Watchers I've just purchased. This cost me 4 divines for a very low rolled one. And I've then hit a divine on it and I've hit 7% reduced damage reduction when affected by determination. And then big increased attack damage while affected by precision. I just had the precision one and that would be fine on its own and they're less than a divine. But as I'm now getting to the point where I'm min-maxing the build, I want more defenses. 7% flat additional fizz damage reduction is massive, especially when I don't have a huge amount of armor. The more I can get, the better. And then lastly, we've got this jewel here, which was again expensive. I think this would have been 2 to 3 divines. It's 11% attack speed and 32% critical strike multiplier. And then the last thing is my lethal pride, which I got lucky and got for a divine, but these are probably 2 to 3. It's got 2 lots of double damage on it. So we have double damage here and double damage here. And then we have intimidate here. It's a shame intimidate is here because I've almost got the suppression where I can move down here. But I don't want to go buying another one and being really specific about where I want the nodes because it gets super, super expensive. So let's move on to masteries. I won't go through the tree in its entirety because it's a very standard attack build. The only thing I will say is these are not necessary. They are like 2.5% more damage per point. The reason I've gone there is because the lethal pride also gives me life. So again, it boosts my defenses up a little bit. So the masteries that are important. Skills by Nightblade have 40% increase effective elusive. This is massive. We have instant leech. Again, we get life on hit from our claw. Adding the instant leech on top of it just gives you much, much better sustain. And as long as you keep hitting and you keep swinging, unless you get one shot, you're not going to die. This mastery, super, super important, especially for bosses. Every 4th hit, you invert their elemental resistances. It's a huge, huge DPS increase. Here, I've gone for increased effective auras, basically to get more defenses. In my mapping setup that we'll go through, I don't run any offensive auras, so getting increased effective grace and determination is really, really nice. Increased effective non-damaging ailments you inflict with critical strikes is really important because it helps us get massive shocks on enemies. I think even on Uber Exarch, I was hitting about 25% shock. So this node again, for 1 point, massive, massive DPS increase on single target. And that's it for the masteries. I've not gone for any more other than a simple 50 to maximum life, just again to boost the life pool up. So the character is 96. I plan to get it to 99. I might just run my own 5 ways to get there. They're quite cheap to buy the emblems because I'd like to pick up some more life nodes. I can pick up this one here, which is 5% and 10% evasion. This one here, which is 4% more life. So a level 98 tree gives me a decent amount of life. So we'll talk about the Ascendancies and why the build is more expensive now than it was before. In my opinion, Lightning Strikers have always had an issue, and all melee builds do, that until you get super, super high attack speed, they just don't feel very nice. Because of that, I've gone Onslaught, extra effective Onslaught, and you get a big more chance to evade attacks during Onslaught, which is what helps us cap out to 95%. And then we're obviously going +1 Frenzy Charge, and then all the juicy bonuses that come per Frenzy Charge. In a League start scenario, you'd normally go these two, but they just don't offer very much now. We can get spell suppression, phasing if I wanted to, I could fit it into a duel, but I haven't really felt the need for it because we're killing stuff so quickly. Ailment avoidance, again, we can get on gear without a problem, especially because we're running a shield. And the exposure, although nice, has less effect now that we can lower enemy resistances every 4 hits. So we'll run through the gem links that I use. There's different setups you can use. I go for Nightblade and Elusive. You could, if you didn't want to go Elusive, you could probably just switch Nightblade out for crit damage. You'd lose a little bit of DPS, but it's more consistent. So the way Nightblade works is when you hit, you get this elusive buff and you get massive boost crit multi. You have much less chance of getting damage taken when you get hit. You get crit strike chance. But the way it works is you get elusive, let's say it's 200%, and it ticks down to 0 and there's no way to reset it. And this is the big nerf that happened a few leagues ago that really made the build not feel great. I still think it's worth running because when you're at average elusive, so halfway, it's still more DPS and more defenses than any other setup. And you can actually plan it when you go to a boss that you get your max elusive straight away so you can get some really good burst damage. And you just have to be a bit careful. If you're fighting a very, very tough boss like an Uber boss, save your Vaal Lightning Strikes until you know you can get your max elusive, all your charges are up, your flasks are up, and you can burst damage. It makes a big difference, and there is more of a skill part of this build than before, because before you were just spamming because you were always max elusive. Now you have to be a bit more careful about how you time your attacks. So we'll go through the gem links that I've settled for. So I've gone for a Molten Shell on left click rather than casting damage taken. I've got Flame Dash linked to faster casting just to make it a little bit quicker. This isn't really necessary. It's just a quality of life thing. You're going to be using Whirling Blades most of the time anyway. The Flame Dash is just for if you need to get over ledges or you get Grasping Vines. Mark setup is just life tap, mark on hit, Assassin's Mark to get extra crit and extra crit multi. So I've got Vaal Lightning Strike 2020. 21 would be nice, but they're very expensive. I might maybe go into a temple and try and double crop one at some point, but at the moment there's much more important things I want to do. Nightblade support, Divergent Multi-Strike because it gives extra attack speed. Obviously, something like Awakened Multi-Strike would be great, but they're very, very expensive. Trinity, Awakened daily damage with attacks that this league, again, are very expensive. I think I paid like 4 to 5 divines for this level 5 one. And then we've got Awakened Added Lightning. These are cheap. When you get it to level 5, it gives you +1 to your Lightning Strike gem, which is actually quite a big DPS increase because you do get flat damage on the gem. In the shield is where we've got Whirling Blades linked to faster attacks, and I also link it to Void Manipulation. Because we have so much damage in the build, you are at risk of dying to Elemental Reflect with Whirling Blades, as insane as it sounds. Linking Void Manipulation to it means it doesn't do elemental damage. We don't scale Fizz, so this 64 to 167 Fizz damage doesn't really get scaled, and, it's mitigated super easy. You won't even notice on Fizz Reflect maps. And then my auras in my helmet, I've got a 21 Determination, 20 Precision, 20 Anger, and Enlightened Support level 3. Obviously, these could be 21. When I'm mapping, you don't need Anger. You do not need it for DPS, even in Juice maps or for Deliod maps, whatever you want to do. The way I've got the build set up, Anger is overkill, so it makes much more sense to run Grace. And that is the reason I've got the gem socket set up specifically like this, because what I can do rather than have to get white sockets on gear is when I need to add a green and take away a red gem, I can just move my auras into my boots. So let's go and do our mapping setup, because that's what I'm going to be running most of the time. So I'd move my Determination, Enlighten, Precision, then I would stick Grace in, then my mark setup can go up here. And then if I want to boss, I can swap it back round. The only reason I do it for bossing is if you're uber bossing, the damage helps. Same in simulacrums, I'll probably run the Anger setup. And Grace sometimes doesn't help in a lot of fights because there's unavoidable attacks, which seems a bit bad, but there are. So Grace basically does nothing. Spell suppression and kind of physical damage mitigation is where you're going to save deaths in bosses like that. Grace doesn't really have effect a lot of the time. And then lastly in the claws, I've just got Multi-Totem, Ancestral Protector, and Culling Strike. The reason for multi-totems is your totems actually tank for you quite well, and they do draw aggro. The more you've got, the more chance you've got of actually doing that. If you wanted to, for extra single target, you could add an Ancestral War Chief into here, pop 2 totems at bosses, you're going to get more damage. I just only want to press 1 button for totems, and this works really well. So that covers off the gem links, the important masteries on the tree, and the gear itself. Now, a lot of people have asked me if I can bring out a budget guide for this, and I really don't want to, and it's purely around this helm enchant. If even on a good evasion or armor evasion base, this could go up to like 3, 4, 5 divines, and it is mandatory for the build, really. Otherwise, you waste a lot of points trying to get an additional projectile into the build, or getting 2 additional projectiles, and you end up really compromising the build. That's why I'm not going to bring out a budget version, and I've not quoted any prices for this build whatsoever, because this could go very, very expensive. And then people don't want to have to buy a 6 to 8 divine helmet just to start playing a build that they may not even like. So I just want to run through the defensive layers on the character, just so I can drill home how much defense this character has for a melee character. So you firstly got your Molten Shell, which is up 50% of the time, which when you've got Armor Flask up is 2,800, which is pretty decent. It would obviously be much better pre-nerf. As I mentioned in the screenshot, when we are mapping, we are max evade chance of 95%, and we'll have a Fizz damage reduction of around 80%. We've got Fizz taken as Ellie, so we can remove some of that Fizz damage over to Elemental. And I've got the balance about right. You don't want to push your armor insanely high, because then those Fizz to Elemental become kind of pointless, because you're probably better off taking them as Fizz damage. We are immune to elemental ailments. We are spell suppression capped. Obviously, because we're running a shield, we get block. So we have 1 in 4 chance to block an attack. When we're elusive, we get chance for an attack that hits us or a spell that hits us to just do no damage whatsoever. We have instant life on the claw, and we have instant leech. We are corrupted blood immune. We're immune to maim. It covers everything other than degens on the floor that are chaos. Even max chaos resistance, they don't feel great. They can do quite a lot of damage. And things like poison and big bleeds can cause issues, but we do have bleed removal. With the life flask, there is honestly not very much I can think of in a mapping environment that should kill you. And even in bosses, I can tank like Uber Exarch and things like that. I've tanked the big Minotaur hits, but just. So they are probably, if they crit, going to kill you. But overall, most of the stuff you're going to be able to tank It's not going to be, I'm going to stand in a Shaper Slam or I'm going to stand in a Maven Memory game. It's not got anywhere near those defenses. But in terms of a normal situation, there isn't very much that should kill this character. So I'm pretty comfortable I can safely map to 99 or 100 if I decide to carry on playing the league that long. So we'll just go through Pantheons because I set up differently whether I'm mapping or bossing. So for mapping, it's Solar Lunaris. It's just way too good not to take. Extra movement speed, again, extra fizz reduction. Chance to avoid projectiles and 6% reduced LE damage, which we're going to have most of the time because we're constantly hit by spells. And then for Exile, I'm running Burning Ground because even with elemental resistances, it does a lot of damage and it just feels nice. If I wasn't doing Exile, I would run with Solar Grithcall, which gives you more damage reduction for each time you've been hit. And enemies that you hit have reduced attack speed, which feels really nice. We get chill in the build, we get shock in the build. So even on bosses, this is really, really nice. When you chill them and they get reduced attack speed, you can see every attack come in. So Solar Solaris I used to take, but actually other than the fizz damage reduction, it's not that great. So we don't get hit very often. So no damage from crits if you crit recently is not that useful because the danger to crits is it might kill us before we even get this buff. Chance of avoid ailments we don't need to worry about, we're ailment immune. Reduced LE damage taken if you haven't been hit. It's very rare you haven't been hit in 4 seconds. So for bossing, I would run Soul of Valkyrie. Again, I'm super lazy, haven't leveled it up and I should. This just gives you defenses against all the stuff that the build is susceptible to, which is damage over time and ground degens. This helps for that. So I don't think there's much more to go through. So what we'll do is see if I've got just a quick Guardian map that we can run through. We'll go and do a Crusader actually. So this will do as it's set up. It's additional proj, Fizzer's Fire, Hinder, and cooldown recovery rate. So we're going to do this. So I'm running a Blight setup, but I don't want to waste your time and do all of the Blight. So we will run our defensive setup, and then we'll run through a quick map, and I'll let you guys go. I probably should have Horizon Doored this. Underground River is a bit of an annoying map because the boss is phased, I think. Or you might be able to blitz him, actually. We'll find out. I also need to get my loot filter stricter because I'm probably wasting like 20 seconds in a map picking up stuff I really shouldn't be picking up. But as you can see, with Whirling Blades and a mixture of Flame Dash, you can just go through super quick. Like Orbs of Regret I probably shouldn't be picking up. They're not even a Chaos. But as you can see, you don't really have to look what you're doing. You just run through and you hit stuff. I was going to say, Baron is probably the worst one to do because his lightning degens are probably the only thing that can do damage to you outside of getting chunked by several mobs in a row. You can obviously use your Vaal Lightning Strike as you're going through the map. I just really don't feel it's necessary. But if you were doing something like Legion, you'd obviously save it for that. Yeah, you can't phase him. That's a shame. So that's kind of how easy the build is and how much damage you can do on these sort of bosses. They just won't hit you before you've killed them. And that's with the defensive setup. With Anger, you've got like 15 to 20% more DPS. So that's kind of it for the video. I hope the build guide helps some people out. So lots of people asking what I'm going to do with the build. And this is kind of what I've done with it. There's not much I can do because of the way I built it to eke more DPS out rather than spending much more currency. So my potential upgrades are maybe Awaken Multi-Strike, but it's very expensive and I'm really not sure it's needed, but it would give even more damage increase on Uber bosses. But I think what I would like to do is actually draw a line under this character, say this is what it is, and then start farming currency for something like a Mazeblood or a Headhunter. That's it for the video. POB is in the video description. This isn't a guide from League Start, so there's no sort of leveling guide because I do think it's something that you need currency for it to feel good. So it's not something I'd recommend doing from scratch if you don't have the currency to at least get a half decent version going. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and see you in the next one.